Now, let's look at the geology. And to do that, I want to take you back first to the 19th century to help you understand the geology. And in the early 19th century is when the idea of millions of years was born. Up until that time, the biblical and traditional view, which was defended by a group of men that I studied in my PhD called the scriptural geologists, they believed what had been believed for 18 centuries in the church, and that was that there was a supernatural creation week, SCW, and God created everything in 6 literal days about 6,000 years ago, and that was followed about 1,600 years later by the flood, and then things continued up to P, the present time, and then they believed that there would be a supernatural ending, SE, to the world when Jesus Christ came again. That view was replaced in the early 19th century, first by the catastrophist view. There were 2 very influential men in development of that view, Cuvier and Smith, a Frenchman and an Englishman, respectively. And they believed in a supernatural beginning. They believed in God, but they didn't believe the biblical account of history. And so they imagined that over the course of untold ages, millions of years, every so often there was a regional or global catastrophe that destroyed much of the earth and much of the life on the earth. And then after each catastrophe, God supernaturally created new forms of life to replace the creatures that had died in that catastrophe. And then things went along for long ages, and then there was another regional or global catastrophe. So this was the catastrophist view. And because they viewed these catastrophes as natural, there might be a future catastrophe of this magnitude. And they maybe believed in a natural ending, but their writings don't really indicate what they believed about the future. That view reigned in geology for about 30 years. But by about 1830, it was replaced by the uniformitarian view. And this view said there have been no regional or global catastrophes in Earth history. The processes of geological change have been uniform all throughout history. Now, the uniformitarians maybe believed in a supernatural beginning. Some of them maybe didn't even believe that there was a beginning, believed in an eternal earth, but they didn't talk about that very much. But you see, there are no seas on the line. Earthquake here, a volcano there, a small flood here, just like we see on average during the course of a year today. Those have happened all throughout history. And the uniformitarian view, by about 1840, became the ruling dogma of geology. About 1840 is when geology became a profession. That's about the time that you were able, for the first time in history, to get a degree at the university in geology. And so from that time on, everybody was trained with a uniformitarian view of Earth history. And the journals, the science journals, the geological associations were controlled by this uniformitarian view. Now, I say all that so that you can understand this quote that I'm going to read to you by an evolutionary geologist who died just a few years ago. And I'm quoting from a book in which a few pages before this quote, he actually warned people like me, young Earth creationists, from using anything in his book to support my view. But Dr. Ager is dead now, and so I don't really care what he thinks. And what's truth is truth. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, so I'm going to use it anyway. And he now knows his views are wrong anyway. So he's talking about the stratigraphic record, the nature of the strata. And he's got a chapter in there on the history of the early 19th century in geology, and he makes this statement. As far as I can tell from his writings, he was an atheist until his death. My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I've been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians, in his mind those were the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. Now that is a very significant statement. He's saying, and I think he's right, that the uniformitarians were controlled and influenced in their interpretation of the rocks more by social and political ideas than by the actual rocks themselves. He goes on to say this. In other words, and he's writing to his fellow evolutionary geologists, we have allowed ourselves to be, what's that word? Brainwashed. That's not my word, that's his word. Brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme or what might be termed catastrophic processes. So here's what he's saying. I took geology in high school, and I learned it with a uniformitarian perspective. I went to undergraduate. I learned geology from a uniformitarian perspective. I went on to get my PhD, taught by uniformitarian geologists. I went out and looked at the rocks, and I was thinking like a uniformitarian. But Dr. Ager was a world-class geologist. He studied on-location geological formations in over 50 countries. And the more he looked at the rocks, the more he began to say, these rocks are screaming catastrophe. The way I was trained to think in school was wrong. I was brainwashed. The evidence of catastrophe was always there, but I couldn't see it because of this brainwashing. Let me illustrate. What's missing in this picture? What was it originally? I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then we'll have a little quiz, okay? Was the original picture A? Anybody want to vote for A? Okay? How about B? Was that what the picture was originally? C? Anybody want to vote for that one? Okay? This is what most of you will probably vote for, as my past experience would suggest. Was that it? Yeah. Nope. The answer is nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. Now what happened? I brainwashed you. I brainwashed you by asking a simple question. What's missing? And what I did was I influenced your mind to think something is missing. I got to figure out what's missing because you asked the question. I brainwashed you. I got you to think the way I wanted you to think. So, we all have the same facts. The evolutionists and the creationist geologists, they have the same Grand Canyon, they have the same fossils, they have the same rock formations, but depending on the starting assumptions will affect not only what you see, but how you interpret what you see. So, Dr. Ager is saying, I was brainwashed with uniformitarian view, set of assumptions, slow, gradual processes, no catastrophes in Earth history of regional or global magnitude. And so when I went out and looked at the rocks, I couldn't see any evidence of catastrophe. But it was more and more observations of the real world that began to show him that the assumptions were wrong. And so he says, if you go out without ruling out a regional or global catastrophe before you ever look at the evidence, you'll actually see the evidence. Now, these kinds of geologists are called neo-catastrophists. Neo from Latin for new. And they are going back to some of the ideas of the early 19th century catastrophists. Now, the neo-catastrophists are still evolutionists. They still believe in millions of years. So they say, you know, if you look at that bottom layer there, let's say that shale, and if you don't look at it with uniformitarian assumptions, you will see evidence in that rock formation that it was formed catastrophically, rapidly. And then if you look at this next layer, let's say it's sandstone, and you look at it without uniformitarian assumptions, without ruling out catastrophe on a very high level, before you ever look at the rocks, you'll actually see evidence in the rock layers that they were laid down catastrophically, rapidly. And if you look at the next layer, the same will be the case. And so they see this evidence of catastrophe. Dr. Ager said that much of the geological record shows evidence of catastrophic formation, but he still believes in the millions of years. So where do they put the time? In between the layers, where there is no evidence. That's convenient. Now the creationist geologists come along and say, now you neo-catastrophists are on the right track. There is evidence in those layers that they were formed catastrophically and rapidly. But if you didn't start, you neo-catastrophists, if you didn't start with the anti-biblical assumption that ruled out a global flood before you ever started to look at the evidence, and if you looked more carefully at that boundary, you would see that there's no evidence of long passages of millions or thousands of years. There's evidence that this was laid down rapid in rapid succession. Let me give you just one example. Here is a cross-section of the southwest United States where the Grand Canyon is located. Here's the Grand Canyon, and when you stand at the Grand Canyon, you see those rock layers on the other side, and they look just like pancakes. And we can trace those rock layers for hundreds, in some cases thousands of miles, and they're just as flat as pancakes. But look at the topography of the southwest United States. We see not only this huge canyon, which is 4 to 18 miles wide and 270 miles long and a mile deep, but we see these other erosional features that look like the ancient shorelines of a huge lake or ocean. But look at those layers in the canyon. We don't see any of those features, which we would expect to see if there was a long passage of time.